Nebraska Territory, June 1873. The sun was dropping low over the prairie grass when Thomas Larkin spotted the figure small, slow-moving, and alone half a mile off the north trail. He pulled his horse to a halt, boots heavy in the stirrups, eyes narrowing under the shadow of his hat. "Someone's out there," he muttered to himself, then nudged his gelding forward. As he rode closer, the shape sharpened into a woman. Her dress was torn at the hem, dust clung to her skin, and her bonnet hung loose around her neck. She was walking barefoot, stumbling every few steps, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding in the last bit of strength she had. Thomas dismounted and approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am." His voice was low, careful. "You all right?" She froze and turned. Her eyes were glassy with exhaustion, but wide and alert. She looked young, no younger than 20, but worn down like she had lived through something no one should have to. She started, but her lips trembled. "I have not seen a soul in 2 days." Thomas stepped closer, steady and sure. "You lost," she nodded, then shook her head. "My wagon. The wheel broke south of here. I walked. I thought maybe I'd find someone, but the prairie just kept going." Her voice cracked. "I do not even know which way I came from anymore." He glanced around. The land stretched in every direction, endless. No trees, no signs of life except for the wind running through the grass. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Maribel Avery," she said. "From Kansas City, or I was." Her hands dropped to her sides. "I do not know where I belong now." Thomas looked at her, really looked. She was not just lost in direction, she was lost in everything. "Well, Maribel," he said, stepping closer. "I am Thomas Larkin. I will be your compass, your shelter. Your forever if you will let me." She blinked at him, stunned. "You do not even know me." "Maybe not yet," he said, "but I know what it feels like to be lost, and I know what it means to be found." Her lip trembled again, but this time it was not from fear or cold. It was something else, something cracking open in her chest. He offered his hand. "Come on, I have a horse, a fire waiting, you can rest. Eat. Then we figure out where to go next." Maribel hesitated, then reached for him. Her fingers were cold, her palm trembling as it fit into his. He helped her up into the saddle, then swung up behind her, steadying her with one arm as they rode back toward his camp. The ride was quiet, save for the wind and the distant call of a hawk overhead. She leaned back against him, cautious at first, then slowly let herself rest her weight into him. At the fire, he handed her a tin cup of coffee and some bread. She ate like she had not in days. "You alone out here?" she asked after a while, voice quiet. Thomas nodded. "Been driving cattle from Wyoming. Ran them north, sold them. Now I am headed home." "Where's home?" "Small cabin by the Loup River. Not much, but it is mine. Quiet place. Good enough for a man like me." She glanced at him through the firelight. "You live alone?" "I do." She looked down at the bread in her lap. "I used to live with my sister and her husband. We were headed west. They left me, said I was too slow, said I was a burden with my ankle." Thomas stared at her. "They left you behind," she nodded once. "Said I would only slow them down." "They took the wagon and the children." "You have children?" he asked, surprised. "No," she said quickly. "My sisters. 2 little ones, Kellen and Katie. I helped raise them. They cried when I was left behind." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That is heartless." Maribel stared into the fire. "I think they just wanted to start over without me." He reached out and gently touched her hand. "You deserved better than that." She gave a shaky laugh. "You do not even know me." "I do not need to," he said. "I can see it. You kept walking when most would have given up. You kept going, even barefoot. You are strong, Maribel." She looked at him, really looked for the first time. "You are kind, Thomas." He gave a small nod. "I try to be." That night she slept under his blanket close to the fire while he stayed up watching the stars. He kept his rifle close, listening for coyotes and watching the horizon. She had been left behind once. He would not let it happen again. The next morning she was quieter but more steady. Her color had returned and she walked without stumbling. "Where will you go now?" he asked, pouring her coffee. She looked down at the cup. "I do not know. I have no money, no family I trust, no place to return to." Thomas studied her. Then he said it again, firmer this time. "Then let me be your compass, your shelter. Your forever." She looked up at him, eyes wide. He smiled, slow and sure. "Come back with me. I have space. I have work. And I have time to wait for your heart to heal." Maribel's lips parted, but no words came. She stepped closer, reached up and touched the collar of his shirt like she needed to be sure he was real. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not," he said. "You are a beginning." She nodded slowly. Then, with a deep breath, she said, "All right, take me home, Thomas." And he did. Thomas's cabin stood where the cottonwoods thickened along the Loop River, their branches swaying in the June wind like they had something to say, and no tongue to speak it. It was a modest place, built of rough-hewn pine, with a sod roof and a stone chimney he'd patched more times than he could count. The porch creaked beneath their boots when they arrived 3 days later, after slow travel, and a pair of cool, quiet nights camped along the water. Maribel stood still at the edge of the porch, eyes tracing the window shutters, the neat stack of firewood, the rusted horseshoe nailed above the doorframe. Her dress had been mended. Her skin no longer held that pale, brittle look it had when he'd first found her. But she didn't step forward. "You can go in," Thomas said, tying the reins to the post. "It's yours as much as mine now." She looked over at him. "You live simple, I like that." He shrugged one shoulder. "Never needed much. Just honest work and quiet land." Inside, the space held the smell of dried herbs and wood smoke, with shelves lined by hand-carved bowls and jars of beans. The hearth was cold, but the ashes were clean. She ran her fingers along the table's edge, tracing nicks and knife marks. "Did you build this yourself?" she asked. "Every piece," he said, setting down his pack. "Cut the logs, fit the corners, even laid the floor one board at a time. Took 2 winters." She turned slowly, her hands folded in front of her. "You're the sort of man who finishes what he starts." He gave a nod. "That's the only way I know." She looked toward the back room where a curtain hung across the doorway. "Should I take the cot or—" "There's only one bed," he said, quiet but firm. "You'll have it." "I'll take the floor," she frowned. "I don't want to put you out." "You're not." He met her eyes. "You need rest, and I've slept rough before." She didn't argue again. That evening he showed her how to use the pump by the back shed where the water ran cold and iron-rich. She laughed when it splashed her arms and he turned away, letting her keep the moment to herself. Later, she cooked with what they had: beans, onions, a bit of flour, and though she moved slow, the food came out hot and steady. They ate by lamplight, the only sound the scrape of forks and the wind brushing the window panes. After, she stood near the hearth, drying her hands on a cloth. "What did you do before all this?" "Rode droves out of Cheyenne. Broke horses. Drove cattle across the Platte. Some freight runs too when the weather turned bad." She watched him. "Did you ever have someone, before this?" He leaned back in the chair, eyes on the ceiling beams. "Once. Long time ago. She married a banker in Lincoln. Said she wanted walls that didn't leak." Maribel folded the cloth in her hands, slow and square. "I never had someone. Not truly. There were men who wanted things, but none who stayed." Thomas met her gaze across the room. "I'm not going anywhere." She held his eyes a long moment, then nodded once and moved toward the back. He heard the curtain sway as she passed through, the rustle of blankets being lifted. That night he lay on a quilt before the hearth, rifle within reach, boots beside his head. The wind moaned low through the chimney, and he listened to the faint creak of the bed above as she turned beneath the covers. He didn't sleep much, but he didn't mind. In the morning, he found her outside, gathering wild mint along the bank. Her hair was pulled back in a braid, loose at the ends, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. She looked up when he stepped down from the porch. "Your land smells better than any place I've known," she said. He crouched near the edge, watching the way the river moved slow and sure. "It's not much, but it holds steady." She dropped the mint into a basket and wiped her hands on her skirt. "I'd like to plant something if there's a spot that gets good sun. There's a stretch behind the shed, soft earth. Never used it for more than tomatoes." She smiled, small and real. "Then I'll start there." As she walked toward the back, Thomas watched her go, the wind lifting her hem, her shoulders straight against it. He felt it then, not just the weight of her presence, but the space she'd begun to fill. A quiet, unfolding thing. By midday, he was splitting logs by the shed, shirt damp with sweat, when he heard her voice behind him. "I found a box of seeds in the pantry, peas and squash." He straightened and wiped his brow. "Those'll do fine." She stepped closer, holding the small packet in both hands. "I never planted anything before, just helped my sister cook what came from the market." He took the seeds from her and held them up to the light. "You plant them deep enough, tend them right, they'll take root." She nodded, then looked up at him. "I'd like to learn." He handed the packet back. "Then we'll learn together." And in that quiet between sunlight and dust, she smiled with her whole face. Not the kind that flickers and fades, but one that settled in, like it had been waiting for a place to grow. The summer deepened. The river ran slower, thick with silt and warmth, and the cottonwoods rustled like old paper above the roofline. By late July, the garden behind the shed had taken shape, rows of squash vines curling toward the sun and neat mounds where the peas had begun to sprout. Maribel spent mornings barefoot in the dirt, sleeves rolled high, straw hat shading her brow. Her hands had grown calloused, her shoulders darker with sun. She moved with quiet purpose, no longer tentative in her steps. One morning, Thomas returned with a brace of rabbits slung over his saddle. He'd been gone since before dawn, riding the southern ridge where the brush was thick and the ground dry. When he reached the cabin, Maribel was kneeling in the yard, coaxing a crooked stake into the earth. She didn't look up until his boots scuffed the grass near her. "You always come back with something useful," she said, rising and brushing her palms on her skirt. He held up the rabbits. "Figured we could cure one, roast the other." "I'll boil the bones after," she said. "Make stock to keep." He nodded, then glanced at the steak she'd been working with. "That for the beans. I thought to let them climb," she said. "There's more life in this patch than I expected." He looked at the rows, at the quiet care she'd put into them. "You've brought life to more than the garden." She paused, eyes on him. "I wasn't sure I still could." He didn't answer right away, just held her gaze. Then he said, "Some things don't forget how, they just wait for the right ground." That afternoon, they worked side by side at the table, cleaning the rabbits, setting the meat to brine in a stone crock. The silence between them had grown easy, filled with the rhythm of hands and knives and breath. When he reached for the salt, she passed it before he asked. Later, while the meat hung over the fire to smoke, she sat on the cabin step, needle in hand, mending a tear in one of his shirts. He watched her from the porch rail, arms crossed. "You always stitch so neat?" he asked. She smiled faintly, not looking up. "Used to do the same for my father. He tore everything he wore, saw no sense in being careful." "What became of him?" She threaded the needle again before answering. "Fell from a scaffold in Jackson County. I was 12. After that, I kept house while my sister made plans." Thomas stepped down and sat beside her. "You ever think of leaving the prairie behind, find a town maybe?" "I used to want that," she said. "A place with shops and bells on the doors." But towns get smaller the longer you stay in them. People watch too close. Ask questions they don't care to understand the answers to. He leaned back on his hands. Out here, no one watches but the hawks. She nodded. And they don't judge. The sun set slow behind the trees, painting the water with streaks of copper. A whip-poor will called from the far bank, low and lonesome. Thomas stood and offered his hand. Come walk with me. She took it without hesitation. They followed the edge of the river where the grass grew high and the air smelled of cool water and damp leaves. He led her to a patch of flat stone near the bend, where the current slowed, and minnows shimmered just beneath the surface. This is where I come when I need to think, he said. Or when I miss things I can't name. She crouched, fingers trailing through the water. Do you come here often? Not since you arrived. She looked up at him, the last of the daylight warming her face. Why not? He crouched beside her. Because I don't need to miss anything anymore. She stared at him, the water forgotten. Something in her eyes shifted, less guarded, more certain. I didn't think I'd ever belong to a place again. You don't belong to the place, he said. You belong here. He touched his chest, just above his heart, and here. He reached out and gently tapped her own. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. They sat there until the light was gone and the stars blinked out one by one. When they returned to the cabin, she didn't pause near the curtain. Instead, she reached for his hand again, and this time he followed her inside. He stoked the coals in the hearth while she lit the oil lamp. Their shadows stretched long across the floorboards. She turned to him, her voice low. I don't want a promise made in haste. I don't offer any other kind, he said. I'm still learning who I am, Thomas. Then let me learn with you. She stepped closer. I've never shared a bed because I trusted someone. He met her eyes. Then let it be trust that lays us down. And when she leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest, he wrapped his arms around her like he'd been waiting his whole life for that one quiet moment. By early August, the rhythm of their days had settled into something neither of them had expected but both understood without needing to name. The garden grew thick with green, the beans curling confidently along the stakes. Maribel had taken to drying herbs along the windowsill, threading them on string with nimble fingers, her mouth sometimes moving silently as she counted leaves or recited recipes from memory. Thomas spent more time close to the cabin than he used to, mending fence posts along the east pasture, fishing from the bend where the river deepened, or checking traps he'd set near the ravine. He left before the sun warmed the earth and returned by dusk, always with something in hand, a length of fresh-caught trout, a coil of birch bark honeycomb, or once, a pair of worn gloves he'd stitched back together for her. One evening, after a long day spent hauling stones from the riverbank to line the garden rows, Maribel sat on the porch step, her feet bare and streaked with dirt. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, watching the horizon where the sky burned down into violet. You ever think about building more? She asked. Thomas looked up from the bit of leather he was oiling. Building what? Rooms? A root cellar, maybe a place for hens. She glanced toward the side of the cabin where the earth sloped. There's space. I've thought on it, he said. Didn't see the need before. She turned her head. And now, he set the leather aside. Now I think a cellar might be worth the digging. She smiled, but it was quiet, more in her eyes than her mouth. They sat without speaking for a while, just the sound of crickets tuning up in the fields and the river whispering beyond the trees. Then she said, I used to picture a bigger life. Not richer, not finer, just fuller. I thought maybe that meant travel or music or letters from far-off places. But now I think it just means hands that keep showing up, a voice that stays steady. Thomas leaned forward, forearms resting on his thighs. I don't write letters, never had the words for paper. You speak plain, she said. That's worth more. He looked over at her, the last light catching the edge of her cheek. You ever miss what you were before? She shook her head. I don't think I was ever fully anything before, just someone trying to fit into other people's plans. You fit here, he said. She nodded once. I know. A few nights later, a summer storm rolled in from the west, sudden and hard. The wind came first, loud through the grass, bending the trees until their limbs groaned. Then the rain followed, thick and slanted, hammering the roof and churning the garden rows into slick furrows. Inside, Thomas lit the lantern and moved to the back window, checking the lashings on the shutters. Maribel stood near the hearth, arms wrapped around herself. Does it flood? Not here, he said. But the river'll rise come morning. She walked to the window beside him, her shoulder brushing his. I never liked storms. They always pulled things apart. He looked down at her. You're not alone in them anymore. She turned, eyes searching his. I trust you. He placed a hand on her back, steady and warm. Then let the storm come. They lay close that night, not out of fear but comfort. The wind shook the walls, but the beams held. Rain drummed steadily, but the roof did not leak. She fell asleep with her head tucked beneath his chin, her hand resting lightly at his chest, as if anchoring them both. By morning, the world outside had changed. The river bank was higher, the garden damp but intact. A few fallen branches lay scattered near the woodpile, and the path to the shed had turned to mud. Maribel stepped outside, her skirt hitched up, and surveyed the damage with calm eyes. Thomas joined her, arms crossed. Could have been worse. She nodded. We'll get it right again. He glanced at her, then said, There's a man I know rides up from Broken Bow every few months, brings seed, tools, sometimes news. He's due next week. She turned toward him. You thinking of getting something? Thinking we could ask if he knows a preacher. Her eyes widened just slightly. You want to marry me? I want to build something that doesn't blow over when the storm comes. She didn't answer for a long moment. Then she reached out, took his calloused hand in hers, and said, Then let's build it together. They stood in the morning light, hands joined, the world damp and raw around them, but the soil was rich. The foundation held, and the promise between them was already taking root. The preacher came on a Thursday. He arrived in a wagon drawn by a swayback mule, dust clinging to his collar, and a small cedar cross tied with twine swinging from the rear axle. His voice was quiet, his eyes kind. Thomas fetched water from the pump, while Maribel offered him cornbread wrapped in muslin. The preacher accepted both like a man used to rough roads and long silences. They spoke beneath the cottonwoods, standing in a patch of shade near the garden. Maribel kept her hands folded, her dress plain but clean, her hair braided in a loop at the nape of her neck. Thomas stood beside her, fingers laced loosely with hers. We don't have a ring, she said. The preacher smiled gently. A vow doesn't need a circle of gold, only a circle of truth. They were married before the sun reached its peak. No witnesses but the river, no music but the wind in the grass. When the preacher asked if they would honor and keep each other, Thomas's voice held steady. I will. Maribel's reply was soft but sure. So will I. After the wagon disappeared down the trail, they stood a while in the quiet. Maribel traced the edge of Thomas's palm with her thumb. I never thought I'd wear a name that didn't feel borrowed. You wear it like it was always yours, he said. The next day, they moved the bed to the east wall, where the morning light touched the curtains first. Maribel stitched new ones from flour sacks, trimmed with blue thread left behind by Thomas's mother, still kept in a tin box under the floorboards. She planted rosemary beside the steps and lined the windowsill with flat stones she'd found near the riverbank. Thomas built a chicken coop near the shed, hammering the frame while she held each board steady. He carved their initials into the back post, not for show, but for permanence. One evening, after a long day of hauling hay and mending the gate, Maribel sat on the porch with a ledger open across her knees. She dipped the pen carefully, her brow furrowed. "Keeping count?" Thomas asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Taking stock," she said. "We have 3 sacks of flour, half a barrel of dried apples, and enough beans to last the winter. I'm thinking we trade for sugar next time the peddler comes through." Thomas leaned against the rail. "You always plan that far ahead." She looked up. "I used to think tomorrow would never come. Now I like knowing it's on its way." He stepped forward, took the pen from her hand and set it aside. Then he pulled her gently to her feet, hands resting at her waist. "You've made this place more than I ever thought it could be," he said. She pressed her forehead to his chest. "And you gave me a place where I could become myself." In the months that followed, the land changed around them. The squash ripened into heavy orange bulbs. The chickens began to lay. Thomas dug the root cellar with his own hands, and Maribel lined the shelves with jars of wild plum preserves and pickled beets. They slept each night with the windows open, the sound of crickets steady in the dark. One morning in November, frost clung to the grass like lace. Maribel stepped outside wrapped in her shawl, holding a letter she'd written but not sealed. "It's for Kellen and Katie," she said. "I don't know if they'll ever read it, but I want them to know I'm all right." Thomas nodded. "We'll send it with the next wagon east." She looked down at the envelope. "I don't expect them to come looking, but I've stopped needing them to." He took her free hand. "You're not waiting anymore, you're living." That winter, the snow came in slow, soft layers. They kept the hearth burning and read by lamplight. Maribel taught him to write his name in a hand that didn't shake. He showed her how to track rabbit prints in the snow. There were no grand declarations, no songs. Just the quiet understanding of 2 people who had chosen each other fully and without hesitation. The spring after, the garden came back stronger. The rosemary had rooted deep. Maribel planted sunflowers along the fence, and Thomas built a bench from lumber he'd salvaged from an old barn he helped a neighbor tear down. One warm morning, as the sun rose over the Loop River and the fields glowed gold, Maribel stood barefoot in the yard, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her belly. Thomas stepped up behind her, wrapping his arm around her waist, his cheek brushing her temple. "Boy or girl?" he asked softly. She smiled, her eyes full and bright. "Doesn't matter, they'll be raised with love." He kissed the side of her head. "They'll be raised with you." The wind stirred the tall grass. The river murmured on. There was no fanfare, no thunderclap. Just the steady, golden light of morning and the quiet joy of a life built from the ground up. Together, they turned toward the cabin, their home, and walked back inside.